In the spring of 1894, a man sat in a lamplit office inside the Smithsonian Institution building and signed his name to a document that would quietly vanish from the public record for nearly a century. He was not the secretary of the institution. He held no title that the newspapers would print in their headlines. But for the better part of a decade, he had been the living engine behind the most ambitious catalogue of American natural and economic life ever assembled. A document so thorough, so dangerously complete in its inventory of resources, patents, and indigenous knowledge that the men who paid for Washington's political architecture could not allow it to circulate freely. Within months of that signing, he was reorganized out of his position. His name was George Brown Goode, and almost no one today knows why he was really removed. That question, why he was removed and what exactly he had catalogued, is what this documentary is about. If you have never heard this story before, I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. It is not an accident. Some of the most consequential decisions in American economic history were made not in Congress or in the offices of robber barons, but in places like the Smithsonian, institutions that seemed harmless precisely because they appeared to be about science, not power. But in the Gilded Age, science and power were not separate things. They were the same thing wearing different clothes. Stay with me. This goes deeper than most people are willing to look. George Brown Goode was born in 1851 in New Albany, Indiana, to a family with deep connections to both natural history and the emerging American merchant class. He was, by every account from his contemporaries, a man of almost supernatural organizational intelligence. He could read a collection of specimens the way a banker reads a ledger, not just cataloguing what was there, but understanding the systemic logic that connected one item to the next. When Spencer Fullerton Baird, then the Assistant Secretary of the Smithsonian, encountered Goode in the early 1870s, he recognized immediately that here was a man who could do something the institution had never quite managed. He could turn a museum into an argument. Baird himself had been building towards something for years. The Smithsonian, since its founding in 1846 under Joseph Henry, had operated on a philosophy of pure science: accumulation for accumulation's sake, publication for the advancement of human knowledge in the abstract. Henry was a brilliant man, a physicist of real distinction, and he believed deeply that the Smithsonian's role was to diffuse knowledge, not to make economic claims about it. Under Henry, the institution published monographs on meteorology and terrestrial magnetism and the migration of birds. Important work, careful work, work that posed no threat to anyone. But Baird understood something that Henry did not quite want to confront. The United States in the 1870s was not operating on abstract principles. It was operating on land, on fish, on timber, on the mineral contents of mountains that had not yet been fully mapped, on the patent potential of biological compounds that indigenous communities had been using for centuries. And the federal government, which funded the Smithsonian, was increasingly being asked by industrial interests to make those resources legible, to create the kind of comprehensive inventory that would allow capital to flow toward extraction at maximum efficiency. Baird became secretary in 1878, the year after Henry's death, and he moved quickly. He reorganized the National Museum, which operated under the Smithsonian's umbrella, into something closer to a working economic intelligence operation than a traditional cabinet of curiosities. Collections were systematized. The cataloguing procedures that had been informal and idiosyncratic under Henry were standardized and expanded, and at the center of this expansion Baird placed George Brown Goode. Goode's formal title shifted over the years. He was at various points the curator of the collections, then the assistant director of the National Museum, then effectively its operational head. But titles were never really the point with him. What mattered was the work, and the work by the early 1880s had become extraordinary in its scope. The catalogue good was building, and here we need to be careful about what we mean when we say the word catalogue, because the popular imagination tends to think of a catalogue as a list, and what good was building was not a list, was a structural map of American economic life as it existed in nature. He was cataloguing fish, yes, and birds and geological formations and ethnological objects collected from communities across the continent. But he was also, in the process of cataloguing those things, documenting the economic logic that connected them, which fish populations sustained which coastal economies, which plant compounds had been developed into working medicines by which indigenous communities and had not yet been patented by anyone, which mineral deposits sat under land that was still technically in dispute, still the subject of treaty negotiations that had not been resolved, which industrial processes submitted to the Smithsonian as models or demonstrations at various world's fairs and expositions contained innovations that had not been formally protected. This was, in the language of our own era, a database, a massive cross-referenced internally consistent database of American natural and economic potential. And it was being built inside a federal institution with federal funding by a man who believed, genuinely, with conviction, that this information belonged to the public. That last part was the problem. The Gilded Age, which is to say, the period roughly spanning the 1870s through the early 1900s, is usually described in economic histories as a period of spectacular industrial growth, and it was. The railroads expanded across the continent, steel production transformed the material world, oil became the substrate of a new kind of civilizational energy. But what those broad narratives tend to flatten is the degree to which that growth depended on asymmetric information. The men who built the great fortunes of the Gilded Age, was the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Harrimans, did not merely work harder than everyone else, or think more cleverly than everyone else. They knew things that other people did not know. They knew which land contained what. They knew which resources were undervalued because the people sitting on top of them did not understand what they were sitting on top of. They knew, years before the general public, where the railroads were going to be routed, and that knowledge was the difference between $100,000 and $100 million. A comprehensive federal catalogue of American natural resources, if it were genuinely made public, would have disrupted that asymmetry in ways that the major industrial interests of the era found unacceptable. Not because the information itself would have been damaging. In the abstract, knowing where the fish were or which plants had medicinal properties was not threatening. What was threatening was the redistribution of economic foreknowledge that a public catalogue represented. If a Montana homesteader could open a Smithsonian publication and read, in precise technical language, that the land his neighbor was trying to buy from him sat above a copper deposit of significant commercial value, the homesteader would not sell at the price being offered. If a southern farmer could read that the botanical extracts his community had been using for generations were structurally similar to compounds that northern pharmaceutical firms were racing to patent, he might seek legal protection. If a fishing community on the Pacific coast could read Good's documentation of the specific ecological conditions that sustained the salmon runs they depended on, they would have standing, real, documentable, scientific standing, to resist the upstream industrial development that was destroying those conditions. This is revisionist history in the precise sense of the term, not conspiracy theory, not the claim that shadowy figures met in secret rooms and issued orders. The actual historical record is more interesting and more disturbing than that, because it is a story about institutional pressure, about the quiet reshaping of a public scientific program by the combined weight of economic interest applied incrementally over years. Good was not naive about any of this. His private correspondence, portions of which survive in the Smithsonian archives and in the collections of the Wesleyan University Library, shows a man who understood exactly what kind of institution the Smithsonian was becoming and exactly what political forces were bearing on it. He wrote to colleagues about the tension between what he called the democratic function of scientific knowledge and what he described with unusual directness for a federal employee in the 1880s as the privatizing tendency of applied science in an industrial economy. He was not a radical. He was not proposing revolution. He was a careful Victorian scholar with impeccable professional credentials. But he believed that the Smithsonian's Catalogue, what he sometimes referred to in letters simply as the Great Work, was a form of civic infrastructure as important to the functioning of a democratic republic as roads or courts. The question of what happened to that work, and to Good himself, requires understanding the specific institutional landscape of the Smithsonian in the years between Baird's death in 1887 and the reorganization of 1894. When Baird died, he was succeeded as secretary by Samuel Pierpont Langley, an astrophysicist and aviation pioneer whose interests were fundamentally different from Baird's. Langley was not an economist. He was not an ecologist in Good's sense. He was a physicist and an inventor, a man fascinated by the mechanics of flight and the behavior of the solar spectrum. He had come to the Smithsonian from the Allegheny Observatory in Pittsburgh, where he had built a reputation as one of the most precise scientific minds in American astronomy, a man capable of extraordinary technical focus on the problems he chose to pursue. But the problems he chose to pursue were not Good's problems, the institutional inheritance he received from Baird, the cataloguing program, the National Museum's expanding role as an economic intelligence resource, the network of scientific correspondence feeding data into Good's great work, was, for Langley, administrative background noise. He was brilliant in his domain and genuinely disinterested in the administrative and economic dimensions of the Smithsonian's Catalogue project. And that disinterest in the political environment of the early 1890s was itself a form of vulnerability, because the men who had been quietly uncomfortable with Good's cataloguing program did not need Langley to actively suppress it. They only needed him to not protect it. They needed the institutional attention to be elsewhere, directed toward Langley's aerodrome experiments, toward the construction of the new museum buildings, toward the political theatre of the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, where the Smithsonian played a prominent public role. And Langley, absorbed in his own scientific obsessions and his own institutional ambitions, was willing to let the administrative structure of the National Museum be reorganized in ways that Good found increasingly obstructive. The reorganization of 1894 was not announced as a political act. It was announced as an administrative efficiency measure. The language used in the internal Smithsonian documents from this period is the language of modernization, streamlining, clarifying lines of authority, aligning the museum structure with best practices in institutional management. Good was not fired. He was not publicly disgraced. His title was preserved in a technical sense. But the actual operational control he had exercised over the catalogue program, the ability to direct what was collected, how it was classified, what was published, and in what form, was distributed among a new set of department heads who reported to Langley rather than to Good. The great work was fragmented. Its cross-referencing logic, the thing that made it an argument rather than just a list, was dissolved. Good did not accept this quietly. His correspondence from 1894 and 1895 shows a man in genuine anguish, writing to colleagues at other institutions about what he saw as the systematic dismantling of a decades-long scientific project. He continued working, he published, he gave lectures at the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences about the philosophy of museum organization that read, in retrospect, as carefully coded arguments for the kind of comprehensive public catalogue he had been building. He was working on a major theoretical essay about the democratic function of museums when he died in September 1896 at the age of 45 from exhaustion-related illness. He had, by every account from those who knew him, worked himself to death. His name does not appear in most standard economic histories of the Gilded Age. It does not appear in most histories of the Smithsonian Institution, beyond brief mentions in specialized museum studies literature. The great work he spent 20 years building was never completed. in the form he intended. Its fragments survive in various Smithsonian publications from the 1880s and early 1890s, reports of the National Museum, bulletins of the Bureau of American Ethnology, the Fish Commission reports, but assembled, cross-referenced and published as the unified economic and natural history of the United States. That Good had envisioned, it does not exist. That absence is itself an important and deeply telling historical fact. There is a concept in economic history sometimes called the enclosure of knowledge, which draws an analogy between the literal enclosure of common land in early modern England. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The process by which land that had been communally held was converted into private property, and the comparable process by which scientific knowledge, particularly knowledge with economic applications, moves from the public domain into private control. The classic histories of enclosure focus on patent law, on the development of intellectual property frameworks, on the corporate funding of university research. These are real and important processes. But the Good case suggests something slightly different, and in some ways more interesting. The enclosure of knowledge can happen not only by locking information up, but by preventing it from being assembled in the first place. A list of fish species is not dangerous. A list of plant compounds is not dangerous. A list of geological formations is not dangerous, but a cross-referenced catalogue that shows which fish populations are declining and why, which plant compounds are being commercialized, by which firms, which geological formations sit under which contested land claims. That is an entirely different thing. That is not a list. That is a map of economic power, and a map of economic power in public hands is, from the perspective of those who hold that power, a threat. Good understood this. His concept of what a museum should be was explicitly democratic, in the deepest sense. Not democratic as a gesture or a performance, but democratic in the sense that the institution should make legible to ordinary citizens the structural conditions of their economic lives. He wrote, in an 1895 lecture that deserves to be far better known than it is, that the museum of the future would not merely collect objects, but would collect relationships, and that the relationship it had the deepest obligation to clarify was the relationship between the natural world, the labour of ordinary people, and the capital that extracted value from both. This is not the language of a revolutionary, but in the Washington of 1895, in the Washington of robber baron senators and railroad-funded think tanks and land-grant universities. Increasingly dependent on industrial philanthropy, it was the language of a man who could not be allowed to finish his work. The specific economic interests that bore most directly on the Smithsonian's Catalogue program in the early 1890s were concentrated in three sectors. The first was the mining and mineral extraction industry, which by 1890 was in the middle of a massive expansion into the territories of the American West, and which had a direct financial interest in preventing any systematic public documentation of what lay under specific pieces of contested or treaty land. The second was the nascent pharmaceutical industry, which was at this moment beginning the systematic commercialization of botanical compounds, many of them derived from indigenous knowledge traditions that the Bureau of American Ethnology, operating under the Smithsonian umbrella, had been documenting in detail. The Bureau, directed by John Wesley Powell since its founding in 1879, had by the early 1890s produced some of the most comprehensive ethnobotanical records ever assembled in the United States. Field reports, linguistic analyses, material culture inventories, gathered from hundreds of communities across the continent. Powell and Good were not always in agreement on methodology or institutional priorities, but they shared the fundamental conviction that this knowledge belonged to the record of American civilization, not to the patent portfolio of any private firm. The third was the fisheries industry, particularly the large commercial fishing operations on the Pacific coast. which were engaged in what we would today recognize as industrial scale ecological destruction, and which were deeply hostile to the kind of scientific documentation of fish population dynamics that Good and his colleagues had been producing. These interests did not operate through some unified conspiracy. They operated through the ordinary mechanisms of political influence in the Gilded Age, through campaign contributions to the congressmen who sat on the committees that controlled the Smithsonian's budget, through social connections to the wealthy donors who sat on the institution's board, through the informal networks that connected government science to private capital in the absence of any meaningful conflict of interest framework. The pressure they applied to the Smithsonian was not the pressure of a conspiracy. It was the pressure of a social system. It was the ordinary, diffuse structural pressure that shapes institutions without anyone needing to issue an order or sign a document. What makes the Good case unusual, and what makes it worth examining in the specific context of revisionist economic history, is that the documents exist, the correspondence exists, the internal reorganization records exist. The gap between the catalogue as Good intended it and the catalogue as it was actually published is visible, traceable, measurable. This is not speculation. This is archival work, and the picture that emerges from that archival work is a picture of an institution systematically reformed away from the democratic function. Its most important intellectual figure believed it should serve during precisely the years when the economic stakes of that function were highest. The decade from 1883 to 1893 was the decade in which the basic framework of American corporate capitalism was assembled. The Sherman Antitrust Act was passed in 1890, more as a political gesture than an enforcement mechanism. The Interstate Commerce Commission, established in 1887, was by 1893 largely captured by the railroad interests it nominally regulated. The Supreme Court was methodically constructing the doctrine of corporate personhood that would define American economic law for the next century. The legal and institutional architecture of monopoly capitalism was being built, piece by piece, in full public view. And in the middle of this process, the one federal institution that was quietly assembling a comprehensive public record of what that architecture was being built on top of was reorganized. The timing is not accidental, but it is also not simple. Institutional histories rarely are. Langley was not a villain. He was a man who cared about airplanes and solar physics, and who was genuinely not very interested in political economy. He made administrative decisions for administrative reasons and was likely not aware, in any explicit sense, of how those decisions served the interests of the economic forces bearing on his institution. This is one of the things that makes the story worth telling carefully. The most consequential suppressions in intellectual history are rarely the work of conscious censors. They are more often the work of people who are simply not paying attention to what they are not paying attention to. Good spent the last 2 years of his life attempting to reconstruct, in published form, as much of the conceptual framework of the great work as he could manage. His 1895 essay on the principles of museum administration, published in the annual report of the Smithsonian, is in some respects the most important document he ever produced, not because of what it says explicitly, but because of the theory of public knowledge embedded in its argument. He is arguing in the careful institutional language available to a federal employee in 1895 that a museum is not a storage facility. It is not a shrine to the past. It is an instrument of civic intelligence. It is the mechanism by which a democratic society becomes legible to itself. And a society that cannot read itself, that cannot access a comprehensive, honest, cross-referenced account of its own economic and natural life, is a society that can be managed, that can be directed, that can have its resources extracted and its communities impoverished by people who know what it does not know about itself. That is not a marginal argument. That is one of the central arguments of democratic theory. And Good made it quietly in the context of a technical discussion of museum cataloguing standards in the pages of a government annual report in 1895, it is worth reading. The question of what the great work would have contained had it been completed is necessarily speculative. But we can reconstruct its outlines from the fragments that were published, from Good's correspondence, and from the Bureau of American Ethnology reports that formed one of its major components. The completed catalogue would have included a comprehensive survey of commercially significant fish populations on both coasts, with ecological documentation of the industrial practices that were depleting them. It would have included a systematic inventory of botanical compounds with known medicinal or agricultural applications documented among indigenous communities, cross-referenced against existing and pending commercial patents. It would have included detailed geological surveys of the Western Territories, with mineral assay data that had been collected by Smithsonian-affiliated researchers and never fully published. And it would have included what Good described in one letter as the most important section, an economic and demographic survey of the communities most directly dependent on these natural systems, documenting in quantitative terms the relationship between resource extraction, community stability, and the distribution of economic benefit. This last section is the one for which we have the least documentary evidence of what it would have contained. It is also, not coincidentally, the section that would have been most directly threatening to the dominant economic narratives of the Gilded Age, because the dominant economic narrative of the Gilded Age, the narrative of industrial progress, of capital efficiently allocating resources toward their highest use, of the railroad and the steel mill and the oil derrick as instruments of democratic prosperity, depended on the communities being extracted from being largely invisible, on their poverty being understood as a starting condition rather than a consequence, on the relationship between the growth of great fortunes and the contraction of ordinary livelihoods being unlegible, undocumented, unmapped. A catalogue that mapped it would have been, in the most literal sense, an argument, not a polemical argument, not a political speech, a scientific document constructed with the full institutional authority of the Smithsonian Institution, with the cross-reference data to support every claim, showing in precise and verifiable terms what the industrial economy of the United States was actually doing to the natural systems and human communities it was extracting from. That document was not completed. The man who was building it was reorganized out of his position in 1894 and dead by 1896. The fragments that survived are scattered across a dozen different Smithsonian publication series that very few people outside specialist research communities have ever read. The story of why is not taught in economics courses or in history courses or in the standard accounts of the Smithsonian's institutional development. It is a story about the relationship between public knowledge and economic power in the specific context of the Gilded Age, and it is a story that, once you know where to look for it, is available in the archives. It is not hidden at all. It is simply not assembled, which is, when you think about it, exactly the problem Good spent his life trying to solve. George Brown Good died on September 6, 1896. He was 44 years old. His obituaries described him as a distinguished naturalist and museum administrator, a credit to American science. The great work was not mentioned. It did not exist in completed form to be mentioned. What existed was a set of fragments in government publication series, a body of correspondence in several archives, and a theory of democratic scientific institutions that would not be seriously revisited until the second half of the 20th century, when historians of science began to ask with new urgency about the relationship between knowledge and power in the institutions that claim to serve the public. The story of George Brown Good and the Great Catalogue is ultimately a story about what public knowledge is for, not in theory, in practice. In the specific, high-stakes, economically contested practice of the Gilded Age United States, where the gap between what the federal government scientists knew and what ordinary citizens were allowed to access was not a bureaucratic accident, but a structural feature of a political economy organized around the private capture of public resources. The Smithsonian still exists. The The National Museum still exists. The archives still exist. The fragments of the great work still exist, waiting for someone to do what Good was prevented from doing, to assemble them, to cross-reference them, to make them legible as the argument he knew they contained. That work has not been done. Not fully. Not yet. A small number of museum studies scholars have written about Good's theory of democratic institutions in terms that acknowledge its political dimension. But the reconstruction of the great work itself, the reassembly of its scattered fragments into the comprehensive, cross-referenced economic and natural history that Good envisioned, remains undone. The last director who tried to do it was reorganized out of his position in 1894 and was dead within 2 years. His name was George Brown Good. And now, finally, you know exactly why you were never once taught it.